Welcome to the webinar, Navigating Risk and Compliance. For those of you who have participated in our Internal Controls Roundtable, you may be wondering where that went, but don't worry, you're in the right place. We received much better response than we thought we would and discovered that an interactive roundtable can be difficult or intimidating with so many participants. So we've changed the format with this webinar, but we will still give you the option to have a smaller informal session, which I'll talk about in a moment. This format will still have the same perspectives brought to you by three of our key thought leaders at RGP, and we still encourage you to speak up and add your comments or questions. Also, feel free to use the chat function for your questions, which I will monitor and try to get to as many questions as possible. We all learn from shared knowledge. However, we will give you the opportunity to choose topics that you'd like to see in this smaller, more interactive format. In the last polling question of this session, please indicate the topics you would like to see, and we will arrange to have them in a smaller format with a smaller group of people so that we can have a more interactive discussion. Again, I want to emphasize that we encourage you to ask questions in this format as well. This session will be recorded and will be made available a few days from now with a link along with today's presentation materials. And of course, we're also offering an hour and a half of CPE credits for your participation today. To be eligible, please stay on for the duration of the program and respond to the polling questions that are launched throughout. You will need to complete 5 of the polling questions offered. CPE certificates will be issued within 3 weeks of this program via email. As a final note, we have 3 terrific presentations and we'd like to hear from all of them. And it would be a happy problem if we have so much discussion that I'll need to herd the program a bit. So please don't be offended if I need to interrupt to move things along. You may also reach out to any of our presenters directly. Their contact information is at the end of each presentation. My name is Mary Turvey, and I'd like to thank you for participating. And now I'll turn this over to our host, Monica LaRue.
Good morning. I'm Monica LaRue. I'm a Vice President of Client Development in our Northern California practice. On behalf of RGP, we want to welcome you today to this quarterly webinar on navigating risk. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to host this forum to share relevant topics that our companies are facing today and be able to do it in this forum where we have companies that are coming from all different industries across the United States. So as Mary said, we really want to make it as interactive as possible. So please do ask your questions and we will be answering them along the way. And then also we do want to host future quarterly sessions that are relevant to you. So if you do have certain topics that you would like us to cover in the future, please also don't hesitate to put that in the chat or you can contact us afterwards. And with that, we hope you enjoy our session and I'll hand it off to our first presenter.
Thanks, Monica. Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. I'm Ian Burnett. I'm a Vice President in the Risk and Compliance practice here with RGP based in Atlanta in the Southeast. So it's great to be able to spend a little bit of time with you this afternoon. Thanks for joining. And as Mary and Monica said, yeah, please feel free to put some questions in the chat. And we'd love to make this interactive. It's a little challenging with such a large group. And as we discussed, we'll have opportunities to huddle in smaller groups, hopefully in future. But please put some questions out there. So the topic that we're going to start with is it time for you to start your own internal audit group? And what we want to do here is, give you some information about when may you want to start an internal audit function if you don't have one already, and why internal audit matters. Of course, there may be people on the call today who work at organizations that already have internal audit or are thinking about starting a function. So I think you're also going to get some value out of the discussion here and the presentation because just like many processes in a business that's growing and becoming more complex, internal audit itself can go through a maturation process for sure, right? And so we'll talk about that as we look at some of the content in the presentation. But I think we wanted to start with the polling question just to get a sense of, in the audience, where are you in terms of having internal audit within your organization? Do you have one? If it's non-existent, is it in the formative stages? Maybe you have one, but it has very limited focus, or maybe you have a mature one and it's actually getting involved in a lot of strategic risks and all of that. That's great. Or maybe you're at an organization where it's just not applicable for the time being. So let's just take a look at the results here, and it'll help us to understand our participants a little bit better. How we doing, Nicole? You got enough responses?
I think we do.
Okay. All right. Share results. Okay. So it looks like many people are actually fairly mature in their internal audit function within their organization. It looks like 47% there. We have 30% that have a function, but it's fairly limited, and a few folks that it's not even started, or it's really in the formative stages, or maybe it's just not applicable. We have a few participants there as well. So that's great. I think everyone's going to get some value out of the discussion. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so risk is multifaceted in today's business environment. There's a lot of different places where risk can come from, and companies can really get into situations where they need to make sure that their clients are in a good place, their regulators are always on top of them. We have a lot of shareholder responsibilities we have to answer to, and of course we have employees that need to be managed and kept up to speed so that they can really deliver with excellence in an organization. And very, very importantly, there's a lot of external disruptors out there, including things like cyber threats, which has been very high in the agenda for many years now. We have technological advances happening with AI and machine learning. And we always have the threat of maybe natural disasters and other things that can cause business interruption. The regulatory environment matters quite a bit, depending on the industries, more so some than others. Financial services, healthcare, very highly regulated, some utilities. But everybody needs to be aware of the regs. And certainly for many years now, we've had financial reporting, regulatory requirements with SOX for public companies. And of course, we all lived through COVID, which was quite a significant disruption. So let's move on and see, where does internal audit fit in terms of you've got all these risks in an organization. Let's go to the next slide. And most organizations, they're building out a strategy to run a business, to really execute at the direction of the board and the governing bodies. They're going to determine what products and services they want to deliver. And, with that goes the formation of certain authority documents and policies that need to be developed so an organization can understand its risk and compliance universe. And an organization that's really forward-thinking is also going to think about risk appetite and risk tolerance. What do they want to be as an organization? And how do they build controls and compliance programs that really respond to the risks and compliance challenges that are out there? And you get down to very tactical levels with controls that are in place to manage risks and monitor compliance and so on. And on the very tactical assurance level, you can do control testing, monitoring controls, and sharing best practices. Internal audit can play a role in many of these places. On a very tactical level, there tends to be a lot of assurance activities that can happen down in that testing and monitoring place. But internal audit can also help organizations really look at this entire governance structure and help the organizations align their organization in a way that they do have good risk management across the organization, and that this hierarchy is working for the organization so that an organization can be best suited to achieve its strategy. All right, let's continue. All right, some people may wonder, okay, what's the difference between internal audit and external audit? They are different functions. I'm sure many of you, we know, have some internal audit, and some are maybe putting it together. Many of you probably also have external audit, and they serve different purposes. External audit is really going to focus on financial statement attestation. Internal audit is going to focus more on process improvement and overall resilience of the organization. There does tend to be overlap. for public companies that are complying with SOX. So that's the internal control over financial reporting element. And both organizations tend to have a role in that, with internal audit really doing independent testing for management, and external audit, of course, doing their opinion over IFCR associated with their overall responsibilities. All right, let's go on. Okay, so who's required to have internal audit? From a listing standpoint, we have a couple of major exchanges here in the U.S. Obviously, the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, and the rules are a little bit different. So the New York Stock Exchange actually requires a company to establish an internal audit function within 1 year of listing. The NASDAQ doesn't have such a rigid requirement. It's actually not required under NASDAQ to have an internal audit function, but it is certainly a leading practice and recommended for all companies to really think about how can they take advantage of internal audit within their organization and put a program together that will help them be successful in achieving that hierarchy that I mentioned around making sure strategic objectives are met. Let's continue. Okay, so when do you put internal audit in place? It really depends on the organization, and complexities there. It depends on the board of directors. It depends on the governing bodies and what they want your organization to be. But in general, companies that are private or pre-IPO may not have internal audit, but that's a good time to start thinking about putting that function in place. There are some very large private companies in the US that do have internal audit, and they are doing that because it makes sense. Having good internal audit capabilities within a large and complex organization really helps provide a very meaningful pillar of the governance structure. So very important there. And then, of course, pre-IPO companies that are getting ready to go public, that's usually a trigger where companies start to think about maybe putting that function in place. And of course, early stage internal audit functions tend to be fairly narrow in their focus, and they might only start out focused on something like internal control compliance for SOX compliance purposes. But it certainly evolves from there as companies become newly public and they become more complex. The focus of internal audit should grow as the organization grows and matures. And by the time an organization gets to be large and more complex, the boards are going to really expect a much more comprehensive internal audit function, including really helping organizations look at those strategic risks and operational excellence while maintaining a lot of the core fundamentals around assurance. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so many of you may have heard of the 3 lines of defense model. This comes from the Institute of Internal Auditors, and it's going to be more formal in some industries than others for sure. It tends to be more structured, more mature in terms of the build out of this model in highly regulated industries like financial services, like healthcare, like utilities. But all organizations that are going to set up an internal audit function should really be aware of this model and what it means. And you can look at it this way. The 3rd line of defense is internal audit. And that means really providing that independent assurance and advisory services with a view to adding value to the people that are operating the business. And by operating the business, that's really more talking about what they call the first line. So those are the people that are responsible for executing the business strategy, running the business units. Second line is typically a compliance function or a legal function that may be building frameworks to support the first line. But it's very important to think through this for your organization and how much formality you want to put into this process. Of course, if you're regulated, it's going to be more formal. And then ultimately, all of this rolls up in terms of the entire framework for how this should be done to the governing bodies, which is the board of directors, and the audit committee, which is a subset of the board. And just going back to internal audit for a second, there's different ways that can be executed, and we'll talk about that in a second. And on the side, on the right, obviously, most organizations will have an external auditor who is doing financial statement audit work and internal control audit work. And internal audit groups tend to coordinate, if you will, and really make sure that they're aligned on how they're approaching some of those activities. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so the Institute of Internal Auditors also publishes what they call the global standards, and these were just recently updated in 2024 with an effective date of January of 2025. And they've kind of taken the older version and just kind of realigned it and restructured some of the things to make it a little bit simpler. But it involves 5 domains broken down into 15 principles and 52 standards. The one that I think I want to talk about the most here is just the performing IA. There's a lot of content here, and we're not going to use the time that we have to go into this in a lot of detail. But it is important to know that when performing IA services, these standards allow different approaches to doing audit, or different focus, if you will, around advisory and assurance. And assurance is intended to be really associated with independent testing, and it works well when you have very mature controls that you can really validate for operating effectiveness. Advisory is going to be much more consultative in nature, and internal audit shops can really help organizations to really look at what they're doing and maybe make suggestions how to improve the controls environment, and help them to think through how to build controls in a department where that may not yet be in place. And that's a very value-added capability that internal audit groups can bring to their organizations, and helps, again, align everything right up on through the top of the organization to make sure that strategy is really on point, and the organization is going to be successful in achieving its goals. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so how do you set up a function? There's a lot of content here on the slide, and everybody will get the deck afterwards. But you have to kind of start out by, if you're setting up a function, really establishing what do you want that function to be within your organization? What's the reporting structure going to look like? How formal will that oversight be in your organization? Are you going to comply with the standards, or not so much in the beginning, but maybe that's something you could adopt later? And you want to take that out and tell your organization what is internal audit for that organization. So conducting an IA roadshow is definitely a good idea, just to kind of explain to stakeholders what is the function. And then, of course, you're going to roll into figuring out, okay, what is the tactical work that internal audit is going to do? And typically that involves some kind of risk assessment and prioritization of risks within the organization. And then you know what you're going to look at, and how frequently are you going to look at certain activities, and how are you going to cover that audit universe that you develop by performing a risk assessment, as well as how frequently are you going to revisit the risk assessment and do that refresh. And then, of course, you get into the more tactical execution of individual audits, where you're going to do process-based risk assessment, really define that audit program and the procedures specific to an individual audit, and go out and execute, whether it's advisory in nature or assurance-related in nature. It will vary in terms of what you do, but that's something you're going to want to define, that scope, make it clear to your stakeholders, what are you doing, what are you auditing? And then, of course, you need to give a readout to your stakeholders and auditees, as well as prepare reporting up to your governing bodies and audit committee members. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so what does internal audit look like from a reporting standpoint typically? There's different ways that this can happen, but the most normal and leading practice is for the internal audit function to be led by a chief audit executive, which could be an insourced position, or it could be an outsourced chief audit executive. So many companies that are looking for expertise will just hire an entire outsourced partner to lead that function for them if they're of a size where that makes sense. And the internal audit function will report directly to the audit committee, which again is a subset of the board of directors, if you're following leading practice. And then administratively, internal audit is going to report to a C-level executive in the organization. Very often it's the CFO, but it could also be a CEO or a chief legal officer. There's lots of different ways that can be structured. And in terms of the outsourcing, that can be very flexible too, right? You could have a whole department outsourced. You could have subject matter expertise outsourced, and bring in people with subject matter expertise on particular risk areas. Or you may have some very straightforward audit activities that need to be performed, but you just don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the arms and the legs. And that's also an opportunity to take advantage of resources outside of the organization. And I do want to mention that some departments actually use a rotational program for some of their audit activities. They'll bring people in from other departments like finance, maybe supply chain, technology. They'll bring them into audit because audit is a great place for people to really learn more about the big picture of managing risk and compliance. And they get access and insight into a lot of different parts of the organization. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so we're showing here just an illustrative example of an internal audit methodology and how you might structure that to execute individual audits. Of course, we talked about, you got to figure out what internal audit is for your organization, do that risk assessment, and then go through the various steps of planning, documentation, and interviewing, and really doing gap assessment and control testing, and then doing a readout to your stakeholders and wrapping up. So fairly consistent across most organizations in how they do this. I will say also that many internal audit shops have looked to adopt more agile methods of doing this with the intent to make risks that are audited very discrete and compartmentalized, which allows them to really dive in on high-risk portions of processes and audit those very quickly. Sometimes over the course of 2 weeks or 4 weeks, they can do a complete audit of a particular risk area and also give that readout back to their stakeholders very rapidly, and also give insights back to their boards and governing bodies very rapidly. It's very important to really think about, what is the ultimate value of this process and the output of internal audit. It's really about insights and giving good recommendations back to stakeholders about how risk can be managed more effectively. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, the other thing that a lot of internal audit functions look to do as they mature is to leverage platforms and tools that will make them more efficient in their delivery. And of course, version control, having one source of the truth. And many platforms, in this example, this is from a ServiceNow platform called Integrated Risk Management. It's actually a platform that allows visibility across all the lines of defense. So in this instance, this particular platform offers compliance management capabilities, risk management capabilities, and audit management capabilities, which aligns pretty well with the lines 1, 2, and 3 that I mentioned. And it gets people off of spreadsheets. It gets people, away from sort of classic Microsoft Office tools, which are not bad, but this is just a much more efficient way to do work in future. Is if you can get on a platform and use workflows, it really can be a game changer. And it does support all the lines of defense. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the next couple of slides are from Gartner, a well-known research organization, and every year they publish a list of internal audit hotspots. And not surprisingly, cybersecurity is one of the items that's at the top of the list and has been for many years. You can see in this particular list, the way that they do it, they'll show you what's hot for 2024 and what was hot for 2023. And it does evolve and shift a little bit. Notably, one of the items that's on the second page is AI. Since that's a fairly new topic, a lot of companies are really trying to figure out how do they incorporate AI into their business, and then really thinking through what are the risks associated with that AI, because you have to really think all that through. There are a lot of risks associated with any technology implementation. AI is no different, and in many ways, it brings into play some newer risks as well. You'll also notice that on this list, this slide and the next slide, a couple of the risk areas that are highlighted here are third-party risk and supply chain risk, which happen to be the next two topics that we're going to talk about. So this is very much on point. And so every organization, can use this as maybe a starting point to say, hey, does this risk apply to me? Is this relevant for me? In many cases, many of these risks may be applicable to all organizations, but sometimes there could be things that are just not as important to some as they are to others. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so again, back to the maturity. I know in the beginning we talked about where are people in terms of having an internal audit function within their organization, and we noted that many people do. So that's great. And so as you continue to evolve your internal audit maturity at your organization, there's things that you can think about, as well as increased use of technology, like a digital platform, like I mentioned. There's also the opportunity to do more with data analytics and RPA solutions with bots, and really broaden it out from what probably in the formative stages is a pretty narrow focused function, maybe just SOX testing, for example, non-repeatable methods. It's very ad hoc in the beginning usually, but there's a lot of opportunity to really move this up the value chain and increase that maturity. And you get to the point at the end where you're really leveraging technology, you're auditing strategic risks, you've really sort of optimized your team in terms of how you're going to execute audits, and leveraged co-sourcing partners to bring in the subject matter expertise that's necessary to really do it in an optimal way. And internal audit will, through this process, really educate lines 1 and 2 in the framework and make sure that they understand their responsibilities as owners of risk and business process people to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to manage risk and getting all those good observations and recommendations from internal audit. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I did include here a link to what's called the Audit Leaders Network, formerly known as the Audit Executive Network from the Institute of Internal Auditors. And I include this here because some of you may be members or may want to become members of the Institute of Internal Auditors, but there's a lot of great resources out there. And one of the things that they enable through this Audit Leaders Network is the opportunity to do benchmarking and take your function within your organization and compare it to maybe some peer companies or companies of similar size. And really, it gives you sort of just a really good way to sort of determine where are you as compared to other firms or other companies in your industry, or and we're happy to help you look at that too. So we do work with internal audit departments and actually independently have reviewed many departments and also provided benchmark information to them from the IAA. So let's go to the last slide. Oh, sorry, polling question. Risks are standard across all organizations, true or false? Okay, I can already see we have the vast majority saying false, which I agree is the correct answer. There are commonalities and themes that resonate across most organizations, but every organization needs to look at its individual risk profile. And that's really the first step in that internal audit process, is to really build out that prioritization of risks in that audit universe. All right, let's go to there you go. There's the results, 82%. Okay, all right, last slide. Just to kind of wrap this up and summarize, I hope you got something out of this in terms of, when is it a good time to start your internal audit? We know from the first polling question, many people have it, which is fantastic. That maturation process that I talked about, hopefully you got some good nuggets there about how can you make it an even more robust function, and why is internal audit an important pillar within a governance framework. Some of the key highlights of what internal audit can do for organizations are to just help the organization manage risk better across the organization. You're going to have increased likelihood of regulatory compliance and reduced fines. Get rid of those compliance headaches by having a good structure around all your risk management. You're going to have improved business performance and better operational resilience. And depending on how you do internal audit, you can also, if you're going to co-source, get access to subject matter experts on a fractional basis. And you may adopt a rotational program, which really can build a really strong talent pool within your organization that has, seen lots of things through working in internal audit and getting that broad organizational exposure. And you're going to have informed governing bodies, the boards of directors and the audit committee. They're the ultimate stakeholders. And as I mentioned, especially for those that adopt more agile methods, giving those insights back to those governing bodies in close to real time is very valuable. So I'll pause there and see if we have questions. Well, it doesn't sound like we do, Mary. I guess I'll hand it back to you. If somebody thinks of one later on in the presentation, let me know. I see one here, recommended certifications for audit. Good question. So there are different ones available for most internal auditors. There's the Certified Internal Auditor certification, the CIA. I think that's a 3-part exam now. It is globally recognized as a great credential for people in the internal audit space. There's another one for those that focus a little bit more on the IT audit space, is the CISA, Certified Information Systems Auditor, and that's actually issued by ISACA, which is a different organization from IAA, but they work, they sort of have parallel things that they do for their stakeholders. ISACA just tends to be a little bit more focused on IT audit and IT risk professionals, but that's another great one. And there's a few others out there. Certifications can really go on and on. Some people love to get them and continue getting them. But I would say fundamentally CIA and CISA are the sort of the gold standard for people in the internal audit profession.
Anything else from anyone? Okay, great. Well, next we have Kyle Moery, VP in our practice, and he'll be talking to us about vendor management risk. Kyle, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Mary. So I'm Kyle Moery. I'm a VP of IT Risk and Compliance here at RGP and been with the firm for 6 years now. Today, I'll be covering vendor risk management, or VRM for short. And I've supported, multiple organizations with their third-party risk, primarily from an IT perspective. I've helped these organizations with VRM program audits, as well as conducting vendor assessments. So organizations can't specialize in everything. They tend to outsource many of their functions to other firms, whether it relates to HR, IT, tax, or other functions within the business. So we have been seeing an increase in regulatory scrutiny in this area, especially in the financial sector. And this basically means that managing vendor and third-party risks has become more challenging. So at a high level, our VRM program lifecycle starts with planning, then moves on to conducting due diligence, contracting and onboarding, and finally, ongoing monitoring. So what are some of the critical success factors that we can kind of look to improve a VRM program? And it really starts with having good ownership and clear accountability. Oftentimes, ownership is fragmented, decentralized. There may be different people all over the organization that are dealing with vendors. And having a more centralized governance function is key. It's important for all of the areas within the business to work together and see eye to eye and have a standard and consistent process that they can execute against. And part of that is just understanding what is the tone from the top. What's the level of risk that the organization is comfortable with, and how can we mitigate that risk to meet expectations. Another area that is really key is having kind of defined policies and procedures around your VRM program, so everyone really knows what to expect. Moving on, there's several processes and tools that are key. So having all of the vendor data managed in a consistent format, rather than having, as I've seen at some organizations, different lists with different information, just having one kind of database that houses everything of importance related to your vendors. A few other items of importance are around, conducting risk assessments, kind of understanding what the inherent risk is for each of these vendors, making sure that your contracts are covering those risks, and that there's continuous assessments and monitoring around those risks. If any issues are discovered in your risk assessments, you want to make sure that those are well managed, and that there's good and consistent reporting, metrics, and scorecards that are visible to leadership to monitor. All right, so how can we do this? Well, there's a couple of enablers that can make this a lot smoother. Yes, this can be done in Word and Excel, but it's a lot easier to execute a VRM program when you're leveraging a digital technology platform. There's a lot of options out there. I know RGP has some great experience with ServiceNow and other products as well. And then finally, having good training and communication around the whole program so that everyone is informed and knows what to expect. Next slide, Nicole. Okay, so here is our maturity model. You can see at the bottom left, it starts with non-existent. Moving up to level 1, the organization may have kind of initial visioning and an ad hoc or inconsistent approach to VRM. Moving on to level 2, a roadmap may now be in place. There may be a overall process that's consistent, but it's still rather unstructured. For level 3, this is where many organizations sit. They've got a fully defined and established process. There's a detailed, documented approach, but there's no measurements or enforcement in place. In level 4, this is where we've added monitoring and consistent measures to identify any improvements. And the final level, level 5, this is where you're really implementing best practices. You likely have some automation in place to streamline your processes, and you're really just knocking it out of the park. Next slide. All right, so we've got another polling question here. Where do you see VRM within your organization? Is it non-existent, initial visioning, fully defined, fully implemented, or are you at that best practice continuous improvement level? And we'll give everyone a minute to answer. All right, and as the results are coming in here, looks like fully defined and established is going to be the winner at 32%, with fully implemented and operational following it closely. So it looks like that's pretty much where I would expect things to be with most organizations. I do see a few that are in the initial visioning and non-existent buckets, and certainly I hope this presentation is going to be able to help everyone regardless of your maturity level. All right. So here we have our vendor risk solution components. Starting with program planning, we'd want to define the scope and goals, define the governance program, as well as establishing consistent taxonomy and standards so that we're all using the same terms and that we're aligned to what those mean. The second component is around vendor inventory. It's really important to establish a complete inventory of vendors within your organization. One way to do this is to look at spend by working with your procurement department. Oftentimes there's vendors that are being utilized in a department that many folks within the organization just may not be aware of. So, doing a real effort to get a complete 100% inventory is key, so that there's no hidden risks for your organization. So once you've got that inventory established, you can stratify those vendors, putting them into different buckets, as we'll cover in more detail on the following slides. Moving on here to the third component. This is really around conducting risk assessments. So developing your process for that, ensuring that contracts are reviewed, and if there's any other artifacts, they're considered within that risk assessment process. And then moving on to the fourth component here, this is around documentation and training. So maybe developing, what the process is going to look like, documenting that process with a RACI chart and detailed procedures, creating a risk library, and conducting training around the expectations. And then the fifth component here for ongoing oversight. So this is where you'll have that technology enabling all of this, hopefully with a nice platform rather than just Excel and Word. There's also going to be a quality review component to the program, and management reporting around what the VRM looks like for your organization. And the final component here is around terminations. You no longer need to use a vendor. What does your exit strategy look like? Do they have sensitive data that needs to be returned to the organization or destroyed at the end of the engagement? And especially when there's intellectual property involved, it should be well established within your contracts that that's returned at the end. Next slide. Okay, so not every vendor is the same. And by putting them in buckets, you can better understand, the importance of each vendor to the organization. So we've got three segmentation groups. We've got tier one, those critical and strategic vendors, tier two for the core and tactical ones, and tier three for commodity or transactional ones. These are vendors that might be easily swapped out with an alternative in the marketplace. And then for risk categories, starting with financial, you could have, insolvency issues at a supplier or vendor. For operational, there could be a non-performance issue. They're just not meeting expectations that we've established or service level agreements that have been put in place. For geographic, there could be a natural disaster that could, take the vendor down, which could have a large impact on the organization at large. Reputational, whether there's ethic violations or anything that is going on at the vendor, it could have an impact on your organization as well. And then regulatory, whether it's a SOX, FCPA, or HSE violation, those all come with concerns for the organization. All right, so just giving a few examples. One is around a software as a service vendor. There's a few things that we can do to kind of mitigate these risks. And, one thing that's really key is having some screening questions. So sending a questionnaire that they can fill out and provide more detailed information around what type of information that vendor may be utilizing, as well as the security controls they have in place to protect that data. And then For another example, we have a facility maintenance service. Maybe they're simply coming in and cleaning the office. The risk here may be more around the staff that's doing the cleaning and making sure that they're conducting background checks and that they've got controls around the staff. And then the last example here, if you've got a supplier of electronics, you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of where these devices and components are coming from. As an example, you don't want to be utilizing Wi-Fi routers that are being manufactured in a country like Russia. There could be concerns around backdoors or compromise to the company's data. So just making sure that you've got a thorough understanding of how these vendors are operating is very important. Next slide. All right, so resilience is important for every organization. When there's a problem at a vendor, it will certainly impact your organization, and you want to make sure that you have mitigating measures in place to make sure that doesn't just knock you down. So there's kind of 4 steps here, identifying what could go wrong, quantifying the impact, putting measures in place to limit the impact, and then if anything does go wrong, making sure that there's kind of an incident response plan in place to address that. And then on the right, as far as conducting vendor risk assessments, it kind of starts with that vendor risk identification step, moving into conducting the risk assessments, ongoing monitoring, putting a plan in place for risk mitigation, as well as risk and control management. Next slide.
Kyle, excuse me, we have a question in the chat. It's
Sure.
from Julio Terrado, and it's how should vendor management reviews be changed to incorporate AI risks with proposed vendors?
Okay, so good question. I think that it's important to understand how your vendors are using AI, first of all. I think that's probably a bit of a gap for many organizations. They probably don't know the answer to that question. I know we're recommending that companies put in policies around AI, how it's used. Often these AI tools are kind of collecting sensitive information. You may have an employee at a vendor going in and asking AI a question. They may be inputting sensitive company information into that question. And the AI tool, whether it's Google or Microsoft or any of the others, they collect and retain that information. So, you want to make sure that you've got a good policy in place so that sensitive information isn't leaking out to the broader world. And then as far as the risk assessment process, I think it's a matter of asking vendors, what they're doing around AI, what their policy is, are they doing any testing, are there kind of whitelisted AI tools and blacklisted AI tools. So just understanding, I think, is key here so that you can limit the risk. All right. So when is a good time to perform a vendor risk assessment? And there's really 3 areas. You want to conduct regular reviews. You want to conduct reviews during the onboarding phase. And then we also want ad hoc reviews. In terms of the regular reviews, if you've got a low-risk vendor, it might be every 2 or 3 years. If it's a medium risk vendor, maybe annually or every 2 years. And then for a high risk vendor, this may be something that you look at twice a year or at least annually. All right, next slide. All right, so on the right here, we've got a Jenga puzzle. Many of you probably played this game before, but you can kind of think of this as your organization, and each block is a vendor. If you pull a vendor off the the top of the stack, it's probably not going to have a huge impact. But if you pull a vendor off the bottom of the stack, your whole organization could come tumbling down, and business as usual could come to a halt. So kind of understanding the criticality level of each vendor, whether it's a critical vendor that's very key to your organization, there's not a ready substitute in the marketplace, or whether it's a non-critical vendor where it's easily replaced with another commodity. And then at the bottom here we have some definitions around the various risk levels. And essentially, high risk means there could be significant regulatory fines, penalties, lawsuits, or reputational damage. And as we move down into medium and low, there may not be any fines, penalties, or lawsuits, and it may be more of a minor risk. Moving on. All right. So once you've conducted your assessments, one way to show those is on a heat map. And on the left, we've got the risk level. On the right, we've got the business criticality. And each of these numbers represents a vendor within the organization. So if we look at vendor number 1 and 6 on the top right, these are two vendors that are very important to the organization in terms of their business criticality, but they also carry a high level of risk. And for vendor 1 and 6, we want to make sure that we've got a lot of controls in place so that we can mitigate those risks appropriately. Looking at the top left here, for vendor 5 and 15, these are vendors that have low criticality to the organization, but they're carrying a high level of risk. And concerning 5 and 15, it might not be a bad idea to look at alternatives in the marketplace and simply, find another one that's carrying a lower level of risk that has better controls in place. An alternative, of course, would be suggesting that they improve their control structure, but given their level of importance to the organization, if there's an alternative, it may be easier to switch. Next slide. All right, so the next few slides are going to shift the focus over to cybersecurity. An interesting statistic is that, in any given year, we're seeing that about half of the organizations are experiencing a third-party breach. And according to this specific poll from the Wall Street Journal, it was 44%. But I wouldn't be surprised if the actual number is a bit higher, simply because some organizations are a little bit shy about answering that question. We're seeing hackers exploit kind of trust between organizations and their vendors. They can kind of get in there, even use artificial intelligence to kind of pretend to be someone that they're not. And this can really, have significant damage, whether it's information theft, reputational damage, or downtime. Next slide. So, another poll from the Wall Street Journal found that companies shared data with an average of nearly 600 third parties. So that is a lot of information sharing, and understanding kind of the web of where your data sits within these vendors is kind of the first step to understanding the risk that lies there. All right. And then I think it's really important that your security department or security group works closely with the third-party risk management team, so that whether it's developing processes or having an input into the risk assessment, that they're just working together and partnering, because cybersecurity is just so important around these vendors. Next slide. All right, so our next polling question: what % of organizations had a third-party breach in the past year? All right, and it looks like most of you selected the correct answer. According to the poll, it was 44%. But I think certainly depending on industry, it can vary. All right. So cyber risk management, there's a few core components to your vendors, whether it's network access, data sensitivity, or their IT general controls. Cyber questionnaires can be used to really better understand each of these components and what your vendors are doing about these areas. Let's go to the next slide here. So there are a number of resources available that can help you establish a vendor questionnaire. So there's the Cloud Security Alliance, there's the Vendor Security Alliance, the Center for Internet Security, NIST. All of these organizations offer kind of a templated questionnaire that can be used to inquire about the security controls for your vendors. And it's often best to find an SME with knowledge in this area to kind of look at each of these examples, pull in the best components that align with your organization's needs, and develop a questionnaire that can be sent to your vendors to collect this information. There's also a questionnaire from the payment card industry, if you're processing credit card payments. And there's also questionnaires from the CCPA and GDPR regulations to address privacy concerns. Next slide. All right, and this is just some additional resources around leading practices and guidance from the Institute of Internal Auditors, from ISACA for IT, the OCC, FDIC, and FFIEC. So I'll leave you with these resources, as kind of best practices for vendor risk management. All right, and I'll open it up for any questions that I can help answer.
Kyle, we do have one question about SIGs. Says, how about SIGs? The person who asked that question, if you'd like to come on audio and just expand a little bit on that question, that might be helpful.
Yeah, we'd certainly welcome some expansion on that. I'd love to hear it in your own voice.
Hey, this is Dean Fox from Stellar Bank. Many of our third parties provide us with a SIG or a SIG Lite when it comes time to asking questions about cybersecurity, information security. And many times that's the only questionnaire or the only document they'll give us, similar to the other questionnaires that you listed. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the acceptability of the SIG or SIG Lite.
Yeah, unfortunately, some vendors kind of get bombarded with different assessments. So, they may kind of just want to default to a simpler approach and just providing that. I think it depends on how important that vendor is. If it's pretty important to your organization and you're spending a good deal of money with them, I would say definitely push back and try to dig deeper. If it's not of a whole lot of importance, you can accept that as it is what it is, and try to consider whether that's going to be sufficient for your needs based on what you're utilizing them for, or if you actually do need to push back and get more information. So it's challenging. I know vendors struggle with responding to all the questionnaires and all the assessments that need to be performed. As a vendor, they have many customers, and it kind of comes back to how important you are to that vendor.
Thanks.
Is there anything else out there that we would want to cover? Okay, great. So for our next presentation, I'd like to turn this over to Robert Olsak. One of the things I would say is this is a topic that came to us from our polling as a topic that has a lot of interest among our audience. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Robert, take it away.
Wow, how do I follow that? Well, listen, so you can go to the next slide. As I was listening to my colleagues articulate some of their insights regarding risk, resiliency, financial controls, I was thinking as I'm listening to their presentations, just all the intersection points of how supply chain crosses a lot of these different verticals. And so by the time we finish my section, we'll hopefully walk away with a better understanding of kind of the shifting perceptions of supply chain resilience, how the organizational strategy and the leadership of organizations across different industry segments influence the concept or the understanding of supply chain resiliency, and then what that path looks like moving forward. I'm going to move a little bit quicker because I do recognize that we are coming up on time, and I also appreciate the fact that many of you are sticking with us. So if you want to go to the next slide, what I found is supply chain resiliency was kind of coined during COVID. And as we've looked at, or, in hindsight, look back at COVID and what we experienced in mainstream media, it really emphasized or, gave this perception that supply chain on a global scale was broken. And there were many pain points and many disruptors that caused that. But also, what does that really mean moving forward? So now you have this understanding, and this word that often pops up in conversations, especially conversations I have with C-suite executives at different companies, is this notion of what is true resiliency. And the definition provided by Gardner, which you see on the screen and you can read, I think really articulates that. But what I would highlight in this is it's the ability to absorb a disruptor, whether internal or external, absorb that shock, even anticipate it, but anticipate it or respond to it in a way where you're not sacrificing cost and quality. And so that can apply to a number of different businesses, anything ranging from financial services to consumer products, retail, industrial manufacturing. And I thought it was a good definition to share with the group. Next slide. So one of the things, as I've spoken on this topic multiple times for different organizations and different groups and events, is if you're to walk away with anything from today pertaining to this particular topic, it's that supply chain resiliency is not a supply chain problem. It is not a supply chain, it is not solely a supply chain strategy or challenge or issue to fix. It's an organizational strategy. Everything that we do within supply chain has an impact on the company, whether it be financial, whether it be operational, human resources, marketing, branding, go down the list of all of the different business units or departments within your organization. And supply chain has a finger on the pulse within what happens to, or the impact to, those different operating segments of the business. But the potential negative consequences and why this is important, and why especially finance professionals, internal auditors, or controllers, people outside of your typical supply chain operations should really care about this, is because of the risk and the exposure from a financial standpoint. And one of the biggest things that we've seen is, as my colleagues articulated, the threat of cybersecurity breaches or hacks, information being released. Companies, I know of one transportation company that was shut down for 6 or 7 weeks due to a cybersecurity breach. And that has a tremendous impact on not only the revenue of the business, but the customer experience, and then even the trust and loyalty in terms of brand recognition in the marketplace. And I'm not going to read all of these, but you can kind of get a sense of how different aspects of disruptors can pertain to different parts of the business, and why finance professionals should be most interested in it. Next slide. And so here's some additional negative consequences. What we're seeing right now, and one of the things I often get asked is, are is supply chain resiliency, or the notion of resiliency, to having that elasticity in your business to expand and contract based on different market shifts. What does that look like, and what is the potential negative impact? And one of the things I would share with you is, obviously, you're looking at the list, you look at lower productivity, higher attrition, legal risk and exposure, lower operating margins. We're seeing that a lot with clients right now who are struggling or who have initiatives in place over the next 12 to 18 months to improve profitability because of the inflationary environment in which we work. That has contributed to lower gross margins or profitability, especially in retail and consumer goods space where the margins are very thin anyways. So when you look at how do you improve the business in a way that manages those same external expectations from either your suppliers, customers, contract manufacturers, logistics providers, but also internally with the stakeholders and investors, you can really start to see how this becomes an important topic. And it's becoming even more important within the C-suite. And a lot of times, to be quite frank with you, when I sit down and have the opportunity to meet with clients, most of the time I'm meeting with the CFO. You would think that it may be the head of supply chain or the VP of supply chain or somebody within the operational space. Sometimes it's the chief operating officer, but a lot of these initiatives pertaining to resiliency are coming from the office of the CFO. And a lot of it is focused on eliminating waste, controlling costs, managing budget constraints, looking at how to better make capital investments across the organization. And when you take that in comparison with what my colleagues were sharing in the previous presentations, you can start to see the points of intersection here. When you're talking about vendor risk management, when you're talking about internal audit, when you're looking at what's the exposure of the business, both operationally and financially. Next slide. So just as you saw with the other presentations, there's a maturity model to this. I would say that one of the things that I often get asked is, well, what are other companies doing? And every industry vertical is a little bit different. Every company, even if they're competing directly within the same industry segment, every business, every organization, and I've had the privilege of consulting with over 100 companies in the last 11 years. Every company has nuances and differences within their operating model. So it's very difficult to say that this is the standard. I think there are some things that are very important in terms of creating foundational principles. But what we're seeing more and more, and I love speaking in less theoretical and more practical terms, is that movement towards becoming more predictive, more proactive. And so when you look at that third vertical where it says integrated, you're looking at digital ecosystem maturity. What does that mean? It means for some companies, for example, there's during COVID and post-COVID, excuse me, there were a lot of merger and acquisitions. And when you have that, you have disparaging systems. You have systems that aren't interfacing with one another. You have data coming from a lot of different places. And so what we're seeing in the marketplace is more synergies and more centricity around creating a single source of truth, not only from a systems perspective, but a data perspective, because the better the data is, the better you're able to mitigate risk and plan for risk. And so when you start looking at what does that ecosystem and the architecture of that system look like, it becomes really important to start having really technical and strategic conversations around what is your technology roadmap. And part of developing that technology roadmap is also doing the risk assessment and the trade-offs between, do I purchase or do I go with a new system? Do I keep the legacy system? Do I add bolt-ons? All of those things create complexities that have to be addressed that tie back into even what Kyle was talking about with vendor risk management. We're looking at greater supply chain visibility. One of the biggest things that we're seeing in the marketplace right now is the use of predictive analytics. So you might have heard this term coined in the market, digital twins. You might have that in your own organization. It may be something that you're entertaining. A lot of companies are actually adopting this. And I would say the biggest shift when it comes to the concept of resiliency, not only at a supply chain, but at an organizational level, is the migration from being post or late adopters to new technologies and emerging technology solutions to early adopters. So if you go back 10 years, you probably had a 5 to 7 year technology roadmap. What we're seeing now is that is accelerated to 2 to 3 years. And companies of varying sizes are making significant capital investments in different technologies to create that predictive or establish those predictive capabilities, including digital twins. And what digital twins does is it enables you to run different scenarios that mimic your real world operating model and test those scenarios to see what the impacts may be. And as a result of those impacts, you can start to make informed decisions about how you manage and mitigate risk. And then obviously resilient. And I would say that currently, from my own experience in the market, I would say 40 to 50% are somewhere in between 2 and 3, improving and integrated. Very few organizations at this point in time are, would they be mature in their resiliency? Next slide. And so then for the purposes of bringing this all together, and this is very similar to some of the other content that you've seen today. It's really the strategy, the operation, finance, and marketing. So it's 4 pillars. It's creating a central governance structure. A lot of times that governance structure may be inclusive of the C-suite, but it may be key stakeholders across the business that are coming to the table. And I think that's a significant shift as well, is when your executive leadership team is looking at organizational strategies, enterprise-wide initiatives that are driving resiliency or the concept of resiliency and mitigating risk and improving operational and financial performance. It's no longer looked at as a service, but it's actually embedded in the strategy. They're having a seat at the table. They're very much embedded in how these strategies are formed and how they're executed in the marketplace and within the organization. Next slide. So I'm really going to pick up the pace here a little bit. I'm not going to harp on this one. You can go to the next one. So procurement resiliency. One of the interesting things is 25% of firms said they could identify and predict a supply chain disruption in a timely manner. And if you look at all the different types of disruptors that exist, and it could be anything from a natural disaster to even internal. So a lot of times we're thinking of disruptors as external influencers or mechanisms or levers that we have to respond to. But if I am going to downsize, or I'm doing a restructure, or I'm taking on an acquisition, or carving out or divesting a portion of my business, that is a potential disruptor. It creates a level of risk. It creates the need for strategic interfaces, change management. But in the back of that is, how does that impact supply chain, and what is the consequences of that? So when we look at procurement resiliency, what we're seeing is really establishment of source-to-pay technologies, more automation, more use of RPA, back office process automation, introduction of robotics, machine learning, Internet of Things. All of these things are coming together to kind of create a more streamlined and more efficient ways of working. One of the statistics I read, it was released back in November of 2023 as a potential forecast for 2024, is that most chief procurement officers were really concerned about attrition and hiring the right level of skill and talent. And so there's natural migration to be more automated in terms of how you manage your source to pay, your procure to pay, your category management, all of your procurement functions, and using the technology and the analytics associated with that to be more fluid. Next. So talk a little bit about manufacturing real quick. 78% of manufacturing companies don't prioritize planning or disruptions. I just read the PMI index came out, and manufacturing had dropped pretty significantly, showing that it was at its lowest point almost pre-COVID. And that can be an indicator of a lot of different things in the marketplace, but what it does innately show is that there is a significant decline in manufacturing production. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. I mean, with geopolitical tensions, trade regulations. But the fact of the matter remains, in order to be resilient, you have to be able to flex. whether the demand increases or the demand decreases or consumer behaviors change or shift, you have to be able to have good relationships with your suppliers, contract manufacturers, or if you own your own manufacturing, being able to adjust up and down accordingly to be able to meet those market demands and shifts. Next slide. And then distribution and logistics. I would say the key takeaway here is really the biggest thing that we're seeing in the marketplace is really focused on working capital, which is, how am I managing my inventory? How am I purchasing goods? How am I sourcing materials? Even to the point of, as it would pertain to finance professionals or potential auditors, is what am I writing off from an asset standpoint? Do I have visibility of products throughout the entire life cycle of the supply chain, from the time that the product is sourced to the time that it's final mile delivered or put on a shelf? And in doing so, what are the risks of managing that? And if I don't have that visibility, where are their blind spots? But largely, one of the biggest areas where companies can really generate immediate cost savings, and we've been able to partner with some really large global companies. And again, going back to the predictive analytics, when you do these models, you can really find significant, and I'm talking multi-million-dollar savings within your inventory planning, your working capital allocations, even in terms of how you manage the cost of goods cost of goods sold or cost to serve, depending on your model. Next slide. So we have a polling question, and really it's, what is the likelihood you'll experience a supply chain disruption within the next 6 to 8 months? Well, it looks like pretty close there, likely and not sure, which the not sure part I totally get. What I would say is, based on industry statistics, 76% of organizations globally will experience some sort of supply chain disruption in the next 6 to 12 months. So it's important that organizations plan for that disruption when it happens. And we don't know what that disruption is necessarily, but it's more of how are you embedding the contingency plans. And I would say the one thing that is a sure constant is, in terms of this topic, is it's always changing. The market is changing, the global environment is changing, the landscape is changing, consumer behaviors change, demands change, economics change. It's just constant change. And so with that being said, you have to almost anticipate there's going to be a disruption of some kind. How you respond to it will mitigate or determine the effect on your financial and operational performance. Next slide. And this is just a quick screenshot or, perspective on different types of disruptions in the past. I'm not going to go into that, but 62% of companies have limited visibility on their end-to-end supply chain, and 15% only have visibility on production. So again, if you go back to what are other companies doing, what is the common trend, or where are companies investing or spending more strategic dollars, it's in creating that visibility within the supply chain, the full end-to-end supply chain, to mitigate risk and manage disruptions. And I believe that concludes this portion of the presentation. So Moery, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Are there any questions from the audience? I had a couple of things that I wanted to double back on. Some of you in the chat may have seen that Laura had a question about, I guess, communication with internal audit. And Ian, I wanted to know if you could expand on that a little bit. Laura points out that there's an audit committee and a risk committee, but what about an on-the-ground standpoint? How can you apply the communication requirements or the integration of an internal audit group into an organization from an on-the-ground standpoint?
Yeah, it's a great question, Laura. And I think part of it comes down to I think I mentioned on one of the slides about in the beginning, if you're establishing a function, maybe doing a roadshow, right? You want your organization to understand how is internal audit being positioned within the organization. What's that reporting structure look like? If you've developed a formal internal audit charter at the request of the audit committee, walking through that. Here are the accountabilities for internal audit in the organization. This is what we're going to focus on. And you want people to understand where you are in terms of that mix of types of audit activities that you'll look at, right? Are you only going to be focused on things that may be regulatory in nature, like a SOX, for example, and doing majority of your time spent doing control testing? Or are you going to be getting into other things that are more operational in nature, more strategic in nature, focused on initiatives? For example, if you're implementing a new ERP system or moving to the cloud, there's a lot of things that internal audit can do around pre and post implementation reviews to make sure that there's good governance there. So I think communication is just very key in that whole process. And I think, if you have a risk committee, and also talking about it with the audit committee and the risk committee, just really kind of sitting down and just making sure everybody's kind of aligned on what that role of internal audit is and how it fits in. And the other thing to point out, it's very important to recognize that internal audit does not own risk management. They make observations and recommendations to people in the business that are managing risks. So I think just having that clarity and making sure that the accountabilities are clear regarding, are you truly structuring this as a third line where internal audit is going to independently and objectively review a lot of things that are happening in the business to make sure you have really good management of risk and good controls. But internal audit is not in and of itself the part of the organization that's responsible for risk management. Risk management really belongs in the business. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Ian. Any other questions from anyone else? Okay, Kyle, I have a question for you. I know that your topic focused on the overall organization, but I know many are concerned with how the external auditors view vendor risk management. And I've noticed in the work that I've done that there's particularly increased inquiry of the external auditors on how vendor risk management is handled. And of course, we all know about SOC 1 reports, but do you have any comments from your observations in working with external auditors, what key things they're looking for in SOC reports, or if a company doesn't have a SOC report?
Yeah, so Mary, great question. I think first off, if a vendor doesn't have a SOC report, and if they're an IT vendor, that certainly kind of raises some concerns. Maybe it's a smaller vendor and they haven't gotten to that stage yet, but that's kind of a flag that they might not be as mature as, some potential other options. So I'll just say that first off. When there is a SOC report in place, it's important to kind of line up the IT general controls that your organization has against what you're seeing in that SOC report to try to identify where the gaps are and what controls may be missing. I think that security controls are an important part of those reports. But, just the basics are important around access management, change management, IT operations. So, another thing I'll say is that it's important that we have, regular reviews around those SOC reports, that they're actually getting done every year, that there's, kind of management sign off and documentation of that review. So those are the things that an internal auditor, an external auditor is going to come through and want to see is in place.
Great, thanks. And Robert, one little question for you. I don't know if it's little or not, but I realize that every company is different, but do you have any insights on how, and that supply chain issues are difficult in general to predict, but do you have any insights on red flags that companies should look out for that may suggest they're heading for a real problem?
Wow. I would say, honestly, it's people, processes, and systems. So if you are having significant issues within your workforce, that's an indicator. High attrition, for example, or the lack of or inability to attract new talent. I think that's an indicator, both from an internal and external perspective. The other part of that question would be evaluating your suppliers. And Kyle brought this up before. You have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers. And what we're seeing, many companies, or especially post-COVID, is diversifying that supplier base. And so by diversifying that supplier base, you're not, as they say, putting all your eggs in one basket. If there is a potential red flag, you look at solvency. The whole concept of vendor risk management and supplier audits and supplier risk management are all intertwined. And so those are red flags. And then I would just say financial performance in general is, have your finger on the pulse, be good students of the profession to understand your industry segment, your business, and what are the levers or what are the potential trends in the marketplace that are leading indicators that there could be a disruptor, on the horizon.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. There final call for any questions, any comments. You could put them in the chat anywhere. Okay. Nicole, I think we have one last polling question. So while we're getting the information on the polling question, I want to thank all of you for participating, especially those who are brave enough to ask some questions. I encourage you to come to these quarterly webinars on navigating risk and compliance. Here's just a question about some of the topics that we have already presented. And to see if you want to do some follow-up on that, this is to help us gauge the interest, and then we can set up these smaller sessions going forward. In addition, from my screen, I don't see the last because of the size issue, but I don't see the last question or the last option, which is please enter any topics that you'd like us to talk about in the future. We'd like to make this relevant for you. Of course, we'll bring our insights from what we see in the market, but we do want to address things that you are interested in. So I think with that, here is all of our contact information. Please take a screenshot. Feel free to reach out to us individually if you'd like. Just as a reminder, your CPE certificates will be coming in about 3 weeks from now. And again, very much enjoy having this presentation for you. We hope that it's a benefit for you, and we hope you'll reach out to us with any questions. Have a great day. Bye now.